I really appreciate everybody's flexibility today. And everyone is well aware, we're all aware that these teams have all been engaged in doing really interesting and important work, and have all been impacted by both COVID-19 pandemic itself and all of the precautionary measures associated with that. And so, as I said in the initial emails, this is really just a chance for us to share some of the great work you've been doing, but also to talk about some of the successes and even some of the challenges that have come up. As I've said to folks who were talking about presenting, we do not expect that you will have been able to accomplish all that you said you would accomplish at the beginning, given this unique moment. We look forward to hearing about the great things that you have been able to do, and really just appreciate this time to be together. I know for me, it's just helpful to see all these faces up there and hear the excitement about some of these projects. So with that, our first presenter will be the Early Caribbean Digital Archive. And I will let Professor Aljo introduce her team and herself as they would like. We have provided a little bit of guidance on these introductions, which we've shared with you. So if you can take a minute, introduce yourself, and your team can introduce themselves, and then there'll be brief presentations.
Sure, thank you, Elisa. And I want to thank the Dean's Office as well for their generosity in terms of funding our SGAs for this grant and just organizing the grant program, generally speaking. The ECDA, the Early Caribbean Digital Archive, would not exist without multi-generational help from graduate students and undergraduates. So it was great that we were actually able to pay people as opposed to just hoping that they would volunteer. So really briefly, my name is, I'm Nicole Aljo. Obviously, I'm Director of Africana Studies as well as Associate Professor of English and Africana Studies. I am co-director of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive. I am zooming in from Roslindale, and I want to introduce the rest of my team, which consists of 3 graduate students and 3 undergraduate students. 1 graduate and 1 undergraduate aren't able to join us today, but we have Alana Prince and Avery Blankenship, who are both graduate students, and Savita Maharaj and Natalie Hackman, who are undergraduates. So I guess if folks want to introduce themselves, maybe Alana, and then Avery, and then Savita, and then Natalie.
Sure. Hi guys, I'm Alana. I am a graduate student, as you know, in the English department, and I am the project manager of the ECDA, and I have been involved with it for 3 years, two of which have been as like the project manager. And it connects back to my sort of graduate research in that I'm interested in studying Black literature and culture, and so this has been really useful to me.
Hi, everybody. I am Blankenship. I'm a second-year master's student in the English department at Northeastern, and I'll be starting my PhD in the English department in the fall. I am calling in from Brookline right now, and I started working on the ECDA a little less than a year ago. I started last May, and the project has really helped sort of figure out for me what my interests in historical newspapers are, and has helped me learn a lot about partnerships in digital humanities, as well as sort of working with embedded stories in the newspaper.
Great. Natalie or Savita, if you could quickly introduce yourselves.
I can go.
Okay, okay.
Okay, so I'm Natalie. I'm a first-year behavioral neuroscience major, class of 2023. I'm zooming in from Houston, Texas. And I got involved with the research project. I was actually just looking at the Northeastern Research Opportunities website, and I was initially looking for a science lab, but then I ran into the ECDA and thought it was really interesting and unusual. And I didn't really know much about early Caribbean history, so I wanted to get involved and do some research.
Hi, I'm Savita Maharaj. I'm a second-year English and Africana Studies major. I'm zooming in from Dorchester, and I got involved with this research because I took post-colonial women's lit with Professor Aljo, and I gained access to material about the Caribbean I didn't know before, and I wanted to continue studying it.
Awesome. And so that's everyone except for Emma Isaacs, who is an undergraduate who's not able to be here, and Tiana Graffenreid, who's a graduate student who's also not able to be here. So I think briefly, I'll just introduce the ECDA, and then I'll let my team talk about their individual aspects of the project. Gabby, can you advance the slide? Great. So the Early Caribbean Digital Archive is an interactive scholarly database housed at Northeastern University. The inspiration from the archive came from a symposium at the Early Caribbean Society in 2011. Basically, scholars noted the difficulties in accessing the documents that we needed for research. And so Elizabeth Dillon and I, who's my colleague in the English department, decided to create this, this archive. So basically we have two primary related overarching goals, which are to uncover and make accessible pre-20th century Caribbean texts. And then the second is to facilitate scholarly interactions with those texts. So we want to go beyond just the static collecting and cataloging and digitizing of the text, which very often characterizes most literary digital archives. Instead, we want users to be able to interact with the texts in various ways. So we envision the archive as a dynamic, open access, interdisciplinary project that brings together scholars and lay people of early Caribbean texts, network analysis, network visualization, archival digitization, library science, as well as graduate and undergraduate students. Our hope is that by making these texts readily available and accessible, more scholars will engage with these texts and contribute to further international understanding of colonial Caribbean cultures and literary histories. And as I said initially, from the very beginning, when graduate students were integrally involved in the project has really benefited from the diversity of project participants. So we've had, so this is Savita, who'll be talking about the project that she's working on this semester. Actually, let me preface that by saying, so our plan had been to develop a few new exhibits this semester, and then specifically to create a concrete plan for working with the public in Barbados. So we had been running a couple of workshops last summer with the public and folks at the University of West Indies about how to work with digital archives. And so our goal for this semester had been to work on creating those exhibits and to create kind of a workflow for that project. Unfortunately, we're not able to travel, right, to go back to Barbados. So what we're going to be doing is making, still creating the exhibits, but also making the material available to the folks in Barbados virtually. So we'll just be, instead of running the workshops ourselves physically on the ground, we'll just provide the material for them to run the workshops when they have time. So that's it for me.
So my project revolves around the origins of Carnival. Carnival is a celebration that marked rebellion against enslavement in the Caribbean. It is rooted in West African and indigenous culture. My project looks at the way history has shaped the present-day manifestation of Carnival and the role rebellion has played in the celebration of freedom. So I gathered sources from the 18th and 19th centuries. Some include the journals of Bertrand Cathorne, a Dominican priest, and L.M. Fraser, an historian who settled in Trinidad, as well as a lot of images. Most of them are from the digital archive slavery image. For example, below I have an image of stick fighting, a war dance that occurred during Con Brûlé, the ritual that preceded Carnival. I also looked at how Carnival is used as a means of empowerment and remembrance of our ancestors. This speaks to the goal of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive as it works to decolonize the archive and bring light to stories that are oftentimes not told. I chose this topic because my family is from Trinidad and I'm able to empower myself through learning about my own history. I'm also really compelled by the power narratives carry. Carnival played a major role in challenging the mere idea of enslavement, gender roles, and place of origin. This work speaks to the type of narratives I hope to continue researching and teach in my own classroom one day. And that's it for me.
Okay, So you change the slide, I guess. Okay.
Yeah. I believe if you click on the little noise symbol, Emma's presentation maybe should come up.
Yes. Yeah, Emma added her
Okay.
narration to the slide.
Hold on one moment. I have to grab something else to open that.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I should have given you a pre-warning, or like just updated you to know that. I apologize there.
No worries, no worries. All right, let's try again. And okay. Is there a way for one of you, if you have it open already, if you could screen share that particular one? It's not allowing me to access.
Alana, can you maybe screen share?
You know, it's also saying that I can't access it right now, which is kind
Oh,
of
shoot. Okay.
sorry. But I guess
well, we can see the slide. So
I don't know what happened yet. But just to give you a little like overview of Emma's project, if that's helpful. Emma is a she's a double major in history and theater, and so the the exhibit that she's building for us is based on Indigenous dance and performance in the Caribbean, and so she's focusing on a couple of different islands, mainly I think Jamaica and St. Vincent, and looking at how Indigenous culture like went on to sort of influence other forms of dance and sort of mix with like the performance of enslaved people and things like that. And so it's really cool, and it's exciting because it mixes together both of her sort of majors in a really cool way. I'm sure she could explain it much better than I could, but just to give you sort of the gist of it. But I think we can move to Natalie now.
Okay, so I begin by working on scholarly introductions for text in the archive, which involves briefly reading the text and then compiling the major focus points in a brief few paragraphs. A scholarly introduction is a mini critical addiction for specific tests in the early Caribbean Digital Archives corpus. Early Caribbean Digital Archive scholarly introductions are written with a scholarly audience in mind, so a good scholarly introduction situates the item for the reader. The scholarly introductions follow a very specific format, which is described in the template section below. The formation includes the production history, circulation, and reception history, and the scholarly responses. So in this way, it is easier for individuals that search the archive to determine whether or not a particular piece is useful towards their particular research plan. Additionally, we want to identify areas that call for further research. A few of the texts that I've been writing introductions for were texts written by doctors who observed medicinal practices in the Caribbean and recounted their observations. So as a behavioral neuroscience and pre-medicine student at Northeastern, after I realized an exhibit examining the medicinal practices in the Caribbean did not exist, I knew that this was something that I would want to create, and I've begun doing research by compiling information from the archive for this. So this is just a future goal and hopefully can be accomplished, just looking forward. I think we can move now. Yeah.
Hi, it's Avery again. I'm going to be talking about my work on the Barbados Runaways project, as well as how working as a member of the ECDA has sort of solidified my path to the PhD in the English department. On the slides, I have a runaway slave advertisement from the Barbados Mercury, as well as an advertisement of a reward to catch and apprehend two people who robbed a store in Barbados. And so that's sort of an idea of the sort of material that I work with as part of my research project with the ECDA. And so working as a member of the ECDA has really solidified my interest in digital archives and historical newspapers as I started applying for the PhD in English literature prior to working as a team member on runaway slave advertisements from historical newspapers, I had done research using historical newspapers through the Viral Text Project at Northeastern, but I didn't really understand in the same way how historical newspapers can be used to begin to understand sort of the lives of people who are outside of the newspaper's readership rather than just the people who are reading the newspaper. As part of my job with the ECDA, a lot of my work has involved combing through issues of the Barbados Mercury, which is a historical newspaper from Barbados. It started running in the 1700s up until the end of the 1800s. And part of what I've been doing is sort of going through every issue of this newspaper looking for runaway slave ads, taking screenshots of these ads, logging their dates and page numbers in an inventory, and developing metadata around these ads. And while this task may seem very tedious, when you look at our spreadsheet of ads, which is 700 and counting, you start to really understand how by removing these embedded stories from the newspaper and lining them all up, they tell a story of slavery in Barbados that involves like resistance, familial connection, movement, skilled labor, and everything else that we learn in history books that slavery wasn't. Additionally, this work has really taught me a lot about how to navigate a partnership, especially an international partnership, because a lot of the work that we do with these ads is sort of facilitated through the National Archives in Barbados. And it's really showed me the necessity of learning how to talk about what I do to people outside of academia, as well as facilitate opportunities for them to sort of work with this historical material that I think can sometimes be a little challenging to work with when you're outside of the project. And these are sort of essential skills for doing work in digital humanities and for doing, good research, especially research that has a really big impact on the historical subjects that you're talking about. And this project has really opened the gateways of possibility for me academically. And it's for this reason that the ECDA has really confirmed my interest in archival research as part of my PhD, as well as the necessity of completing that work specifically in Northeastern's English department.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. So yeah, thank you guys. I guess I know we're a little bit over time. We're kind of a bit over time, so I'm just going to keep my remarks brief. But I just wanted to say, like, as you can see, each of these students that have spoken, as well as our co-director, Professor Algeo, like really contributes, a unique set of skills, and that is all sort of centered around their own individual majors and interests, and then like sort of long-term academic and career goals. So like, for example, Emma's, who unfortunately could not make it, like her work brings a very much needed Indigenous perspective to our project. Savita is really thinking about, what is sort of how do old traditions sort of keep up and sort of keep manifesting and keep being celebrated. Natalie's work on medicine is sort of super important in the digital humanities now, especially considering Sari Altschuler's like latest NIH grant, which is going to bring the medical digital humanities here to Northeastern in a really cool way. And of course, as Avery has already sort of so wonderfully put, like the Barbados Mercury project that she's really been working so hard at is keeping us on the ground and keeping us connected to the Caribbean in a ways that's like sort of always been central to what we aim to do. And so again, I just want to say that like, I think having these many generations working with us and many perspectives, it just keeps everything sort of new and exciting. I mean, the ECDA has gone through several iterations in its history, and I feel like we've sort of hit a place now with this grant and with these many different students that like really is going to make it sustainable for the future and just going to bring a lot of new cool stuff to the ECDA. And that's
great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for our first presentation. There's a lot of exciting work that's going on in that space, and I'm sure we'll have some great Q&A at the end of the following presentations. Our second presentation is by Professor Ryan Cordell. And Ryan, do I see you up there?
Oh, I'm here.
So I think, why don't I hand over to you and let you introduce yourself and your team introduce themselves and tell us about your really interesting work.
Thanks. So we're a much smaller group here today. So I'm here, and Kenny Orvats is here, and I'll be handing off to him here in just a minute. Our undergraduate researchers, unfortunately, none of them could be here today. Kenny's a PhD student in the English department. Smit Patel and Dominique Byron are both undergrad engineering majors. And Coulter Guillem is a biochemistry and Spanish major. All three were work-study students working in the press, who, in part, the skills that our two engineering students kind of brought to the press is what inspired this research project in a way. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. But if you can advance the slides, thanks. Great. So we should have put the social media handle on here, because if you want to know what we've been up to at Huskiana, really the best thing to do would be go look at our Instagram. I think we try and post there. We only opened a little more than a year ago. We opened in February of 2019. The birth of Huskiana really came out of my research and teaching in book history and media history. I try and teach in very applied ways, and have for years been bringing sort of letterpress supplies into my technologies of text class for hands-on labs. My work is primarily on 19th century newspapers. It's in digital humanities and book history. But when I think about technology, I think about technology historically, and I want students to not think only about, very recent technology, but to think about how that recent technology is all tied up and entangled in historical technologies and the assumptions, that were sort of baked into those, this sort of long continuum. And so I do that in these experiential ways in true Northeastern fashion, I suppose. So anyway, we founded the Letterpress studio in the English department in Northeastern in February of 2019 to give a space for not just my classes, but for other classes to come in and do this kind of experiential work, for students to pursue independent projects, both creative and research projects. And since then, we've had students from the College of Art, Media, and Design who have been coming and doing design projects, faculty from CAMD who have been coming in to do creative and research projects. We've had lots of classes that have come in for sessions. Some of Nicole's classes have come in for sessions at Huskiana. And throughout that time, I've been trying to think about also research projects, like applied research projects we could do, either historical or contemporary. And I was really intrigued by a line of research that I see in the library, archives, and museum world, where they've been using 3D printing in order to either create objects that are too fragile to investigate or are too fragile for the public to sort of handle, or to try and reproduce objects that no longer exist in order to, try and deal with them as objects. And so that is kind of where this all started. And then in a conversation with Smit Patel, so one of our undergrad work study students, I just sort of floated the idea. You can see that in the Letterpress studio, everything is material. Every letter that you want to print is an actual object that you hold in your hands and you put into place in order to reproduce what you want. The same is true of images. If you want to produce images, there's an actual essentially carved block that has the image on it that has to be produced by an artist and then actually sort of put into place, locked into the press in order to make reproductions of it. And so I kind of floated the idea, we have a few of these historical blocks, whether we could use a 3D printer to make a new one. And he said, well, can I work on that? And I said, yeah, sure. Like, while you're in here, if you don't have anything else to do, experiment with that. And he spent a few days doing it and then produced this object that actually worked in the press. We locked it in. It was a little husky, the first one that he made, and we were able to print with it. And that was sort of the genesis of this project. So I will pass it off to Kenny to talk about the work we've done, but just briefly before I'll do that, I will say, I feel like this project has been uniquely, maybe not uniquely, this project has been particularly hampered by current circumstances because it relied on us producing physical objects in specific labs on campus and then experimenting with those objects in the press, seeing what was working, what wasn't working, and then iterating on top of that. And we were quite literally just about to head into the makerspace in Camden for a workshop to produce our first batch of materials the week before everything shut down. So since then, we've been doing what we can virtually, and we're hoping to have a lot of stuff, as Kenny will describe, ready to produce as soon as we are able. But we are in a bit of a holding pattern at the moment and doing what we can. So I'll pass it off to Kenny to talk about what we have done and where we are and where we hope to be going.
Hi everyone, I'm Kenny. I'm a third-year PhD student. I'm currently in Berkeley, California, so it is 8 a.m. So I'm sorry if I'm a little tired. I think we could go to the next slide at the moment. So just a little bit more about the Letterpress process. I think one thing that's really helpful for conceptualizing this process, this project, is considering how Letterpress works as a medium, because we are so invested in that process. You compose individual sorts into lines using a composing stick. You lock them into a frame, and then you place them into the press of the sort you see on the right. But we also have a variety of other printing presses in the studio that we use. But I think we can go on to the next slide to talk more about the specific Letterpress Goes 3D project. So as Ryan was talking about, this project emerged largely from a desire to reverse engineer historical woodcuts using 21st century technologies, but also to create new printing blocks incorporating new media and cultural developments. So I'm thinking things like the Husky, but also things like dyslexic adaptive fonts, QR codes, stuff of that nature. And through those interconnected processes, we're looking to achieve a few different goals. One is better our material understanding of print culture and history through actual physical engagement of replicas of those historical artifacts. Another is to develop methods, as Ryan was mentioning, for using 3D printing and laser cutting for the restoration, preservation, and usage of archival materials, which is one thing that makes this project I think quite unique, is the ability to not only create 3D models in a digital space that can be viewed in a digital space, but to actually create functional replicas of the historical artifacts themselves. One thing we're interested in is generating new creative and expressive possibilities through the interaction of new and old media. For instance, things like printing the QR code brings us close to the work of Amaranth Borsuk, who's very invested in the interaction of digitality and print, and thinking about how those things can interplay, especially in this old school format. Letterpress Goes 3D is also very much invested in increasing critical awareness of media formats through both pedagogy and practice. So through students and others using the press, and through us teaching them about it. I should also mention that in addition to our work study students, we have worked last semester with 2 undergraduates who are doing substantial independent course related work, one of them looking to replicate historical advertisements, for instance. And finally, it's always a goal of ours to strengthen our role as an academic, creative, and community resource for education and creation. We want to be, and I believe are, a sort of hub for creative expression and community in the Northeastern English department, and Letterpress Goes 3D really benefits that, because, for instance, if one group we've been talking to is a group of instructors who are looking to start a poetry mini publication, and they would like to do it in Letterpress, and they also are going to be developing a sort of logo for their work, and the Letterpress Goes 3D project would allow us to 3D print or laser cut that image or other images that they would like to incorporate into their work. So it's another great way to integrate the individuality and the specific desires of different parts of Northeastern. So next slide. So here's some of the technical details. So we are engaged in two main processes. One is making 3D models for 3D printing, and the other is making laser cuts on wood. Generally speaking, we find images for both from local archives, such as the Northeastern Special Collections, or online databases, such as the Boston Digital Consortium. We then take those images, we scan them from print, or we get the pre-existing scan. We prepare it in Photoshop and Illustrator to sort of clean it up. Then we've used a variety of programs to generate 3D models. We've used Photoshop, we've used Selva, and we've used SolidWorks, which Smit Patel, as Ryan mentioned, is a specialist in for us. And then we add the image to a block to ensure the correct height, because all printing matter needs to be 0.918 inches. And we print it on the 3D printer. We've used the 3D printer in the library successfully, and there are also 3D printers in the CAMD makerspace and in engineering that we have been in contact with about potentially using. Go to the next slide. Laser cuts is a sort of similar process, but rather than generating 3D models, we only need to generate a 2D image that is then carved out by the laser. You can sort of see an example of that on the bottom, taking that historical woodcut from a ballad. It is then inverted to ensure that it will print right facing and to ensure that the carved out portions are properly carved out. We're just begun collaborating with the CAMD makerspace on actually cutting the laser cuts and trimming down the wood to the proper size, and before things unfortunately got a little derailed by the situation. But laser cutting seems to be a very promising way for us to create really detailed and true to the original woodcut carvings, which is very exciting for us. So go to the next slide. So here's some results. So this is a woodcut that I sort of took through the laser cut process. On the left is the woodcut. On the right, in the middle is the image that we printed on the letterpress with the woodcut, and on the right is the original historical image. So you can see that we were able to achieve pretty great, I'd say, accuracy to the original image, especially considering that this was done on a piece of wood that was not initially the proper height for letterpress. And so with additional height precision, we'll be able to get an even cleaner print. But we were happy with how this one turned out as a starter. We go to the next page. Here are a couple examples of 3D prints of non-historical work. So you can see, as Ryan was mentioning, we have a couple Northeastern Huskies that Smit Patel designed. And we also have a QR code that leads to our website, which we've integrated into things like bookmarks, as you can see in the middle, and posters and things like that. Cool interaction between digital and physical realms of media. So some next steps. There are a lot of really cool things that we want to do, or at least I think they're really cool because I'm a nerd like that. We want to make some fonts. We're looking at replicating historical fonts, but we're also really interested in new fonts, fonts designed around accessibility, fonts that incorporate digitality, like a pixelated font, also filling in gaps in fonts in our collection. So fonts like wood type that might not have enough letters in there. We're also interested in collaborative work. Typography students traditionally make fonts in at least one of their classes, and it would be awesome if we were able to collaborate with them in actually laser cutting or 3D printing some of their work so they could print it on the letterpress. It'd be tight. We're also looking more into material experimentation, determining what the ideal Specifications for the 3D prints are because there are things like material and density that have to be set, as well as ideal wood varieties for laser cutting. We're looking at things like durability, level of detail of precision, and things like that when we're thinking of materials. We also want to streamline and refine our processes and documentation, because a major goal of this project, more so even than actually creating these artifacts, is detailing a system of processes so that others can do this sort of work as well and create these sorts of things. So, so continuing to improve our documentation and the processes of detail, and also finally keeping an eye on collaborative possibilities, interdisciplinary possibilities. We spoke with engineering about involving engineering classes in creating 3D prints as part of a project that they might do. We are very much tied to the CAMD makerspace, or not tied to, I should say, but interacting with the CAMD makerspace and making things. And also, we have an eye on the Boston area printing community, the Letterpress Printing Museum, and other community spaces with which we could engage, including our fellow, oh my gosh, I feel so bad. The high school writing group that is in the English department has reached out to us about doing collaborative activities as well. So we're really excited for all these things, and I'm sure we're over time as well, but that's our presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really amazing work. And if you're, I noticed that some other people have joined us. So if you're joining now and you notice we're a little bit behind schedule, that was a choice we made at the beginning because we had some flexibility at the end, and we have so many great students presenting their work. So we will try to kind of stick within our time, but certainly we've been a little bit flexible. So next will be Professor Tiffany Joseph presenting on her team with her team. Tiffany, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. There you are. Hi, Tiffany. I'll let you take it away, introduce yourself, and have your team introduce themselves.
All right, great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tiffany Joseph, and I'm an associate professor of sociology and international affairs, and I am Zooming from Framingham, Massachusetts. And Kevin Ha is the SGA for the project this semester. Kevin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Kevin. I'm a second-year sociology PhD student at Northeastern. Very briefly, I just study transnational migration, transnational networks, research flows, and then community integration. Great to be here.
Thank you, Kevin. So, Gabriel, you can go to the next slide. So the project that I've been working on with Kevin and other members of my research team this semester is looking at how public policies like the Massachusetts Health Reform, the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, have reshaped immigrants' healthcare access. And I've really been focusing specifically on the Boston area, trying to understand the local impact of these policies as they've been implemented, particularly since Boston is the capital of the state that implemented, the first state that implemented comprehensive health reform, which then became the model for Obamacare. But because of federal level restrictions based on documentation status, most immigrants around the country cannot benefit from these reforms. And so my project, I've really been trying to understand the micro level impact of these policies on immigrants in the Boston area as they try to navigate the healthcare system and figure out what their options are. So Gabrielle, you can go to the next slide. So for the project, what I've done is conduct a policy analysis of the Massachusetts and the ACA health reforms, paying particular attention to the way documentation status shapes the coverage options that are available for people. And in order to get a clearer understanding of that on the ground locally, I've conducted 207 interviews between 2012 and 2019 with 3 groups of relevant stakeholders in the Boston area. First of all, I've really been interested in understanding the immigrant perspective. So I've interviewed Brazilian, Dominican, and Salvadoran immigrants, who are 3 of the largest immigrant groups in the Boston area. They're all from Latin America, but they have a range of documentation statuses in terms of phenotype and racial characteristics. They also look different, so this shapes their experiences with the healthcare system. And also Brazilians speak Portuguese, whereas the other 2 groups speak Spanish. So I've been interested in how all of these factors have shaped their experiences with the healthcare system system locally in the Boston area. I've also been interviewing healthcare providers to find out how the Massachusetts and ACA reforms have shaped their ability to provide care to their immigrant patients. And then finally, I've also been interviewing employees from different immigrant and health advocacy organizations in the Boston area to try to understand more about the local socio-political context and the climate in the Boston area and how that also shapes the decisions that immigrants are making around their health care. You can go to the next slide, Gabrielle. So here is an overview of the interviews that I conducted for the project. You can see that I conducted interviews at 3 different time periods, from 2012 to 2013 under the original Massachusetts reform before Obamacare was implemented. Then I did another set of interviews in 2015 to 2016 after Obamacare was implemented here in the state of Massachusetts. And then lastly, I did a final set of interviews that actually wrapped up in the fall of 2019 to try to understand how changes under the Trump administration attempts to repeal and replace Obamacare, to dismantle the policy, as well as implementing proposals and policies around immigration that have really had a negative impact on immigrants' inclusion within the United States. I wanted to understand how that was being felt and experienced by immigrants in the Boston area as they tried to navigate the healthcare system. Next slide. So here, this table just basically shows some demographics of the 2012 and 2015 immigrant samples to give you an overview of the wide range of people that I interviewed. The next slide includes providers, demographic information on the different healthcare providers that were interviewed for the project as well in 2012 and 2015. Next slide. And then this slide here includes information on the wide range of organizations within the local area that I interviewed as well. Next slide. So basically my goal for this semester were all listed here. These were the tasks for the different team members working on the project. So this included cleaning interview transcripts from the 2019 interviews that I conducted, starting on coding those interviews in the qualitative software package that I use called NVivo, and then keeping an up-to-date library database on anything related to immigration and health policy that's been published in peer-reviewed articles, but also newspaper articles to stay up to date on all the policy changes. And my last goal was working on submitting an external grant proposal as well. Next slide. So here, this table basically includes information on the different tasks and how they were allocated among members of the research team. I had a total of 12 students working on the project, in addition to Kevin, who was graciously funded by CSSH, the SGA. I had another graduate student who also worked on the project, and then 10 other undergraduate students working on different tasks of the project over the course of the semester. And these students were funded by a wide range of sources within CSSH, but also the broader university, which you can see listed below. Next slide. So now Kevin will take over for a little bit and just talk a little bit about his experiences working on the project this semester.
Yeah. So I'll just briefly talk about the experiences and skills that I've gained from working on this project. As I mentioned, I'm a second-year sociology PhD student here, and this is my first semester on the project, and it's been an amazing experience. I've typically done research using a lot of quantitative methods, computational methods, working with census data and such, but being on a qualitative project is something that is very beneficial to me in the long run. You know, I've been working with a great amount of qualitative data, at first hand coding them, and then inputting them into NVivo. And I have never worked with NVivo before, so this has been very, very informative. It's given me a ton of insight into the whole process of qualitative research as a whole, as I watch Dr. Joseph, you know, kind of go through the process of how to present their information as well. Additionally, I've studied immigration for years now, but I've never kind of incorporated the health component and as well as the policy component to research, and sifting through the literature has been something that's given me a great growing familiarity with health outcomes, especially among immigrants in the Boston area. That's been great. And lastly, the professional and managerial side is something that, you know, I don't think can be undercounted as well. Working on such a large research team with as you saw, 207 interviews has been a wonderful experience. Maintaining communications, co-coding, exchanging ideas, and matching our individual timelines and all of our different situations into one master group timeline, and making sure we move forward seamlessly. And then last but not least, the file management, naming conventions, archiving, all that stuff is very important, I think, to having a well-oiled research team. So I'd just like to thank Dr. Joseph for this wonderful experience, and yeah, that's it for me.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin. So just to move on in terms of thinking about what we, the research team, were able to accomplish this semester, I've listed all of that here. So we got a lot done, and I'm really thankful for the support that I had through this, through the SGA, through CSSH, and the rest of the research team, which allowed me to get all of us to get quite a bit done on the project this semester in terms of all of the goals that I had, or the tasks that I had set for the team at the beginning of the semester. And the last goal there, I was able to successfully submit an external grant proposal to the National Library of Medicine through the National Institutes of Health, with a lot of the help and support of Elisa here. So thank you so much, Elisa, as well. All right, next slide. So just briefly, I'll talk a little bit about the benefits and challenges. So starting with the benefits, to have a lot of students that were really interested in this topic and engaged was really was something that was really gratifying to me as a professor. And so because they were passionate about the topic and learning more about the different tasks that it took to be a part of the project, we as a team were able to accomplish so much more together than I ever would have been able to do on my own. And so I'm really thankful again for having really engaged students to work on this project. And that also forced me as a professor to really be able to build upon the organizational, time management, and training and mentorship skills that I had, because managing a research team this size with people working on different tasks, different parts of the project, was very much a challenge. On the front end, it took a lot of time at the beginning of the semester to train students to work with software packages like NVivo and also EndNote. And we also had to overcome challenges too in terms of campus software tech issues with regard to NVivo not being as readily available on different types of machines on campus, and students having to us having to find workarounds for students to be able to gain access to NVivo on their individual devices. And then lastly, just managing a team this size meant scheduling lots of meetings in person, but also more recently, due to current events, remotely. So that really forced me, because it was such a big team and people were working on different parts, we often had to have like different meetings for different members of the team, and I had to usually be at most of those meetings. So that was another challenge in terms of keeping the work moving forward, but it was all beneficial. Okay, and then the next slide. So these are the next steps moving forward for the summer of 2020. You can see all of my goals there, with the biggest goal being by the end of the summer, I'm hoping to have been able to write the empirical chapters for the book manuscript on which this project is based, and obtain a book contract. And Kevin, thanks to CSSH, will be able to continue on in the summer, as well as 4 of the undergrads from this semester. And we're in the process of applying for a combination of honors and peak awards, the base camp awards, for support for the summer. So last slide. Thank you so much, CSSH, and thank you all for your attention. Look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Once again, just great, nice job with the presentation from such an interesting project and team. So our last presenting team will be led by Professor Maya Poe. So Maya, I think I will hand it over to you. Are you there?
I am here. Hang on, let me fire everything up here.
Yep.
And maybe Greg and Devin can also unmute. They're both their audio and their video at this point.
Excellent. So if you can just introduce yourself and have your team do the same, and take it away and tell us about your interesting work.
Sure. So I'm Maya Poe, an associate professor of English, and I'm also director of the writing program. And my research specialty is on questions of fairness in writing assessment. I am zooming in today from Harvard, Massachusetts. So Greg?
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm calling in from Dorchester. I'm a 5th-year PhD candidate in the English department, and I'm concentrating on writing and rhetoric. So generally speaking, my work involves bringing data analysis methods to answer humanistic research questions, but probably more importantly to me at least, the converse of that, which is to bring methods from the humanities to data analysis. So I'm the stipended graduate assistant on Maya's project, and it's been an opportunity for me to apply that background to writing program administration.
Hi, I'm Devin. I am a third-year English undergrad. I'm zooming in from Vero Beach, Florida. And I initially applied to some social media, something or other in the writing department, and then Maya reached out to me about this project, which was way more interesting to me. So I am happy to be here.
Wonderful, thank you. And I want to thank Lisa and the CSSH for making this research possible. I want to say a couple of things. A couple of people in the audience. I also want to recognize Tom Akbari is in the audience. He's the director of the Writing Program Assessment Committee, for whom we've been deeply indebted to for their participation in our study, as well as Julia Garrett, who's a member of the Writing Program Assessment Committee. So let me say before we begin our presentation, something that's I think new is that the Writing Program has a long history of doing self-assessment work and kind of faculty-led research. Oftentimes that's not necessarily been funded, so it's nice to see us be able to get these kind of grant-funded initiatives. This project has been funded through the CSSH initiative, as well as through the Conference on College Composition and Communication Research Initiative. And secondly, I would like to say the thing that's really kind of cool about it is we're not just a multi-generational grant, but we also have, because through the assessment committee, part-time lecturers as well as teaching professors also involved in this project. So we're both multi-generational and we're also kind of multi-rank in what we're doing here. So we go next slide, Gabby. So great. So in the field of, excuse me, in the field of writing assessment today, we don't think necessarily just about trying to make better tests or trying to make more accurate decisions based upon test scores. We don't think about validity and reliability solely. We think a lot about questions of fairness, because assessment, and particularly literacy testing, have a long history of abuse and discrimination attached to it. And you really can't do assessment, I think, with any kind of good conscience without wrestling with that history and the social consequences of what we are doing with assessment projects today. And this sensibility is captured in this nice quote here from a white paper from the National Council of Teachers of English and the Council of Writing Program Administrators, in which they say the fair use of writing assessment is crucial, since it can be used to make important decisions about individuals. The concern for fairness should guard against any disproportionate social effects on any language minority group. And it goes on to talk about how assessment really should be about creating opportunity, not merely to rank and sort people. Whether we're talking about college admissions, or we're talking about placement testing, we're thinking about outcomes assessment, or even classroom-based assessment processes. Go to the next slide, Gabby. And this really is what my collaborators, Norbert Elliott and Asal Bianoy, and I have been doing for more than 10 years through a number of different publications. We're looking at questions about racism and other kinds of discrimination in assessment. And as we said in our 2018 book, our overarching goal in what was then the last 7 years has been to refute insidious denials of diversity, ignorance of educative processes, and displacement of responsibility. So next slide, please. In the context of Northeastern, what fairness means, I think, is that we must think about the potential disparate impact of assessment practices on multilingual writers. Within each institutional context, right, we have to think about what potential disparate impact might be there. And so why are multilingual writers important for us to think about at Northeastern? If we go to the next slide. We see here, this was initially a build slide, so I'm sorry, it's a lot to process at once. But we see here, since 2006, international students have increased by 433% at the institution. And now international students comprise 20% of our undergraduate population, fingers crossed that continues in the future, and upward to 50% of our graduate student population. And that first plot there is from IPEDS, so Integrated Post-Secondary, a database through the Department of Education. Second bullet point, but what we see is that multilingual students, or international multilingual students, whether it be international or domestic, are not simply basic ESL students at Northeastern. If we look here on the left plot, what we've learned from our multilingual writers survey is that our second language writers, or multilingual writers, have been learning English for a long time. And in fact, what we see over and over again is that they are really almost lifelong English language learners. But we see on the right-hand side that they don't necessarily have the same level of confidence. And in particular, Students whose first language is Chinese, that is Mandarin, are much less confident, say, than students whose first language is Spanish. And we see certainly through the pathway programs also a very different kind of profile than of language learners. Some of the students, of course, who would matriculated and some of them don't. The other thing that we've learned through our research, previous research about multilingual writers at Northeastern, is that they're highly mobile, right? Northeastern students go all over the world. They have these really, really interesting cosmopolitan identities. And so the way we've kind of think about them is Northeastern students might be characterized as super diverse, or context, excuse me, might be considered as super diverse, which is a term that comes from British sociolinguistics research, because their students have highly mobile, sophisticated linguistic identities. But the question for us in the writing program is, do our practices actually support those students or not? So next slide, please. We see here that the writing program for years has had classes on our books, these kind of ESL classes. For example, this class known as English for International Students was started in 1968 as a non-credit bearing class. So students would pay tuition and not get credit for that class. By 1977, that class did carry credit, and today that's known as 1102, which is a first-year writing equivalency class. We've also had advanced writing in the discipline classes, but you only see this really in about the last 10 years that we've begun to think about research on multilingual writers kind of as an intellectual project through the writing program. So in 2009, underneath the directorship of Chris Gallagher, the Multilingual Writers Research Project was started as a faculty-led initiative in the writing program. By 2014, with Neil Lerner, they started to survey students. As we've seen in the previous slides, gotten some very good data for us about who multilingual writers are at Northeastern, because right, the institution doesn't collect that kind of data for us about who these ESL or multilingual students even are. And so today, what we needed to think about as I took over the writing program is how do we think about multilingual writing program assessment? So we can think about it as faculty-led research, course-based work, but in our program assessment, what are we actually doing? And here's where the Writing Program Assessment Committee has been really important to us for this research project. Underneath the chair of Tom Akbari, we've had 6 teaching professors, 4 part-time lecturers, and 2 graduate students, one including Greg, as well as, of course, Devin, who's part of this project, help us do our research. The overall kind of charge for the assessment committee in the last year has been, what are the outcomes for multilingual students in our writing program classes? And to give you a sense here of scope, right, the writing program offers 150 classes each semester, as well as between 60 and 70 classes over the summer. We serve more than 6,000 students. We also serve in our writing center about 3,000 students a year. So we touch really every undergraduate student at Northeastern. So if we want to know how our outcomes are serving multilingual students, are there disproportionate effects on those students? And if so, are there ways that we can instead create opportunity? So next slide, please. I'm going to hand it over to Devin. Oh, excuse me, one last thing, I'm sorry. Too quick. So for today, I want to move on quickly to Devin and Greg, but I can say we had 4 research questions that guided this grant-funded study. Today, we're only going to be able to talk about our first question because of time constraints. And our first question was, are students, all students, meeting new path learning goals for AWD courses? And how are students who identify as multilingual writers meeting those goals? So you see here, we've just taken a slice of looking at students in the advanced writing class, because we cover all students for AWD classes. About 40% of students don't take first-year writing, and we answer those questions in our questions 2 and 3. So just for this first question, looking at AWD writers, how are all students meeting new path learning goals? And then more specifically, how are multilingual writers meeting those goals? So Devin?
Next slide. Hi, so there are currently 2,034 students enrolled in advanced writing in the disciplines classes this semester. And our methods for analyzing the program's efficacy and opportunity for multilingual students was first collecting writing samples in 3 phases in different genres. Greg and I anonymized the files, which was more of a rote task, but is very important to the project as a whole. Next, we scored them. We scored them both holistically on a scale of 1 to 6, and then based on trait, new path, and diversity traits. And then we held training calibration sessions with the Writing Program Assessment Committee. So to prepare for that, Maya, Greg, and I pulled writing samples which we felt represented the highest and the lowest end of the data set holistically, and brought them before the committee to sort of say, well, is this paper better or worse than this? And that sort of established benchmarks and helped us, it sort of acted as a norming process for the scoring. And it also helped to identify traits we were looking for. Those were just graded on a high, medium, or low scale. And then the scores, using the sort of calibration in that meeting, went off on their own and scored their piece of the 300 so samples. And then next we surveyed AWD students. And as Maya mentioned earlier, it helps us to give a more complete picture of multilingual writers and linguistic identities that the school does not collect for us. And then finally, the next step of our project is performing corpus analysis on the student writing that we've found and see what we can get from it. Next slide, and I'll hand it over to Greg.
Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about the results from that first phase that Devin mentioned. So when Devin and I anonymized the writing samples for scoring, we collected some identifying data about them, and you can see that in this middle data set here, the sample data. So each sample was given its own number. And when we distributed the samples for scoring, like she mentioned, we did that along with the Google form. So scorers use the form to assign samples a holistic score as well as a score for individual traits, which is shown here on the left. We use the sample number then to connect those scored samples back to the students who wrote them. What's really useful though in faceting that data further is we were able to get data from the registrar and then connect the sample data to the registrar data using students' NUIDs. So there we can get information about students' courses of study and GPA and some very basic demographic information. So what I did this week is I joined these three data sets using the scripting language R to perform a preliminary analysis of the scores from this first session. If you could advance to the next slide, please. So here we see that the holistic scores form a normal distribution, which we expect for this kind of scoring. This kind of serves as a check to make sure that we did a good job of training our scorers. Next slide. And here's the data from the traits that we asked scorers to rate in each sample, and these correspond to the new path learning goals. So here we can see that students in AWD are meeting or exceeding these learning goals. They can recognize genres and adapt them for their purposes. They can negotiate these goals with the expectations of multiple audiences. They display correctness in grammar and punctuation. The lowest of these that you can see on the right was critical source use, and that replicates some previous findings about our program. Something also that we think we might further encourage of instructors in the future, given our age of disinformation right now and everything. The next slide, please. So we added to those new path learning goals because the writing program, excuse me, has an additional learning goal, which is that students bring diverse perspectives to their writing and that they show an awareness of others' perspectives. So here we can kind of see the discrepancy between the scoring of that particular trait and the other traits. So while we espouse an inclusive learning environment, that's something we might be able to do a little bit better since this curve skews a bit low. Next slide, please. One way that we might be able to get at this discrepancy is by faceting the data a little further according to student demographics. So here we use some very limited categories and separate students between domestic and international. This doesn't effectively capture students' linguistic identities, which that survey data that we're currently collecting might allow us to do, but it does let us say something about at least students' geographic diversity. So here we can see that both domestic and international students are meeting new path learning goals. International students are not quite meeting them at the same levels as domestic students, but they are. Of interest here, though, is that we can see that students more likely to show an awareness of diverse perspectives in their writing were more likely to be international students. This is something we might expect, right? Since these, we tend to acknowledge that these students bring with them a variety of geographic and linguistic backgrounds. But since domestic students are less likely to show an awareness of diverse perspectives in their writing, we might conclude that our instructors are not, on the whole, using their assignments to encourage an awareness of diverse perspectives quite as well as they could. So next slide. The next steps here are, we still have to score, this just represents descriptive assignments. So we have 2 more genres that we are scoring, including a research assignment and a reflective assignment. Once those are done, we have to clean that data, and then we want to combine it with the survey data to get a bit more of a granular understanding of how these data vary with students' linguistic demographics as opposed to just with residents. From there, I rotate off the project at the end of this month, and a new member in the department on the team, Charisse, will take up a corpus analysis with, I believe, Devin and the assistant director of the writing program, Matthew Hitchcock, to look at the text data of the writing samples, which we were able to glean from the samples themselves.
All right, next
and
slide.
That's all I have to say. If anybody else from the team has anything to add,
I just want to
or if anybody has any questions.
I just want to end with a thanks again to Tom Akbari. Maybe Tom, you could say hi, unmute yourself, say hi. I saw you out there.
Hello, I'm here.
Okay, so there's Tom Akbari. He's chair of the Writing Program Assessment Committee. Tom is a part-time lecturer in the writing program, and we are very thankful for Tom's leadership on the assessment committee and getting so much faculty buy-in to that. I also want to thank Chen Zhanglu, who is our coordinator of multilingual writing. And once again, thank you to you, Alyssa, and to CSSH for funding our project.
Of course, great. Thank you, everybody. It has just been really amazing to listen to the hard work, to hear you all talk about the hard work you've all been engaged in this semester, moving these 4 projects forward. Before we shift to our Q&A, I want to allow a moment for Dean Uda Poiger to add some comments here. I know she's been listening with great interest.
Yeah, and I'm clicking too many times on the camera here. I just want to say congratulations to all of you for the great work that you are doing with your teams. As Elisa mentioned, this has been a pilot project for the college, and it's really great to see how, first of all, the diversity of the kind of work that you are doing, but also the various ways in which you as teams have worked together. And of course, this also really responds very much to something where we think we really still have room to grow as a college, and that is involving undergraduate students in our research enterprise in increasing and at the same time very much meaningful ways as well. I think Elisa probably set out already how the question and answer period is going to be done. I expect she'll remind you one more time about the use of chat functions and other aid capabilities we have on Zoom. Let me just say that I've really enjoyed learning more about the work that you all are doing together, and look forward to having additional opportunities to hear outcomes and impact of this work. So thanks a lot from me, and I look forward now to hearing the question and answer period as well. Oh, back to you, Elisa.
Absolutely, thank you. So please go ahead and post some more questions in the chat box. In the meantime, let me just see if anybody's popping in here. So DCA, so I have a question for Professor Aljo's group.
Yes.
Can I just ask, what does DCA mean?
It's supposed to be EDCA.
Oh,
the Early
okay.
Caribbean Digital Archive.
Thank you. I thought it was one of those, like, you know, shorthand Zoom things that I'm learning. So a question for the Early Caribbean Digital Archive team: were there trends in runaway slave ads? Did you see a point of time where the ads peaked, for example? And did you draw any conclusions on that?
So I wonder if Avery or Alana, if you would like to respond to that question, since Avery and Alana were the graduate students that came with Elizabeth and I down to Barbados last year when we started the project with the Barbados Archives and the University of West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados.
Yeah, so we're still very much in the process of collecting the ads out of the issues of the newspaper. We've gotten up to the year 1808, which is just after they've sort of banned the importation of new enslaved people into Barbados. And what I've noticed just sort of as I've been like clipping the ads and going through the different issues of the newspaper is that definitely once they were no longer allowed to bring new people to the island, it seems like there's way more ads in the newspaper. It seems like there's a lot of like desperation to keep track of the people they have already, I suppose. So I have noticed, I mean, it goes from maybe 1 or 2 ads in an entire issue of the newspaper to sometimes 10 or 12 ads in an issue, and sometimes there's 5 ads on one page of the newspaper as well. So yeah, so we're still in the stages of collecting advertisements, but we have been noticing the numbers seem to be increasing as we sort of get closer and closer to the abolishment of slavery in Barbados. And like Professor Aljo just posted in the chat box, we've also found a lot of interesting ads posted for runaway wives and even sisters sometimes, warning anybody reading the newspaper to not let them charge anything to, you know, the poster's account, basically. So those have been really interesting to think about in terms of like, where do those fit in if we're talking about these sorts of ads.
Great, thank you. So I had a question about the, one of the things that I was very impressed with was the diversity of interests and programs and disciplines that the students involved in these projects have come from. And Ryan, I was particularly struck in your team's group. I think that's true across all the teams, but it was really quite evident in your team that the students you work with come from many programs and many backgrounds. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that worked out as you moved your project forward.
All right, what else?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the class that sort of, you know, prompted the founding of the press eventually has always drawn a lot of engineers and computer scientists. I think there are some advisors in those programs that point people to that class as a way of fulfilling their humanities core requirement. But they tend to get really excited to think in historical and sort of theoretical ways that they haven't really been encouraged to think in their computer science class, and to think about a much longer history than I think they've imagined for their own work. And one kind of outcome of that, sorry, I know there's some, my kids are just at the other end of the, I look like I'm at Huskiana, but I'm not. I'm sitting at my kitchen table and the kids
no
are doing
apologies necessary.
Schoolwork at the other end, so.
No apologies necessary.
Yeah, so one really interesting thing though, since the press has been founded, is that it has been a magnet for students from engineering and CS. I think at this point, it's only been a few semesters, but I think all 5 of the work study students who have come to work at the press have been from the sciences. And I think for the engineers in particular, the press it's a very interesting place because it's both material science, like you're working with these objects that you have to apply pressure to in a particular way to make them hold together in order to produce a thing. You're working with, you know, this equipment that was engineered. So I think it's a kind of, it is an engineering problem, but it also has a creative output. And several of them have said specifically that their attraction to it was that it both allowed them to tap into this sort of, it was like math meets creativity. And so that's, yeah, we had this amazing independent project that a student did in the press last semester. He was in my class and produced a gorgeous book that I wish I could show people, but I can't. Just an incredible book with these complex layouts. It was a work of art. I mean, it was beautiful. He took the Minotaur myth and literally made a maze on the page out of this text. It was incredibly complex, but it required an enormous amount of math for him to figure out how all the pieces would literally fit together and hold together. And for him, as a computer science student, that was the attraction. It was like math meets creativity, and he loved that about it.
Yeah, that's great.
Loved it enough to spend about 60 hours in the press producing this book. So yeah.
I guess another thing that I want to sort of add jumping in is I found that a lot of the engineering students and other non-humanities students who work within the press really value the opportunity to explore their artistic side. I think there are a lot of undergraduates at Northeastern that are genuinely interested in both STEM and non-STEM areas, and so it's really cool to be part of that.
A bit lax in my timekeeping duties and allowed these to all run over because there was so much for a second. Tom?
Hi, Elisa. Sorry, we had, I think, a delay on there. I need to unfortunately run to another meeting, but I just wanted to, Elisa, thank you and thank Dean Porter and especially all of our faculty and students, both undergraduate and graduate students. It's been a real pleasure to engage with you here virtually today. And I'm just struck at the range of questions and how we've all engaged in questions of the past as well as the present, and that we're all engaged in some way in using really innovative and timely methods, particularly digital methods, to answer questions from an interdisciplinary lens. And so I just want to thank everybody again for joining and supporting these really exciting and engaging projects. And to the students who are all over the country too, thank you for continuing your work and your collaboration with our faculty. And I look forward to having the opportunity to learn more from your projects over the course of the summer. Thanks everyone, take care.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to do one or two more questions, probably one, and then allow us a few minutes to wrap up so that the teams can have a little bit of moment to meet privately at the end. But there have been a couple questions here for Tiffany's group, and if people are following in the chat. And one I thought that was really interesting was Tiffany's, Nicole was wondering what the backgrounds of the undergraduates working on your projects are. Were they all folks interested in health to begin with, or did they come with a variety of interests?
Hi, so thank you for the question, Nicole. So it's a very diverse group of students. So some of the students I got on the project had health-related interests, and they came through the Health Equity Internship Program, which runs out of the Institute for Health Equity and Social Justice Research, where Elisa is the director. Some of the other students learned about the project. Particularly, I was trying to recruit students who had language proficiency in Portuguese and Spanish. So I kind of used word of mouth to ask some faculty colleagues of mine who taught Portuguese and Spanish classes or classes in Latin American studies if they knew of any students that might be interested in working on the project. So that's how other students came interested in the project. It's a wide range of disciplines. Some students are in the STEM fields and the health sciences and biology. Others are more humanities, so social sciences. So it's been a wide range of students. And I would say probably in terms of years at Northeastern, it's ranged from some first year up to graduating seniors. So I've been working with a wide range of students in terms of diversity of race and ethnicity, academic backgrounds, and interests as well. And they've all been really, at least from my conversations with them, they talk about how much the project has really changed as they think about what they hear when they hear anything in the media about immigration policy or health policy and the impact that it has on people.
That's great. And I think the last question that we will do is to Maya Poe and your team. My guess is that you had some ideas about what you would find as a team as you started this project. And I'm curious if you ended up finding anything in particular that really surprised you or was counter to what you expected.
Yeah, I can lead off there. So one thing we first had to do was, because we don't have common assignments in the writing program, we first had to figure out if there was any kind of uniformity to our curriculum to think about what papers we were going to collect. And so it was kind of nice to see that there was some kind of typical continuity in these AWD classes. So that was kind of a pleasant surprise, I suppose, there. In regards to actually the data sets, we were not surprised that, of course, that there's no institutional level data about multilingual writers. I think that if I think about things that made me happy was like, you know, when you do this assessment work for outcomes, I think you do it in advance as kind of preemptive strike. So you don't say people like, is your department working or not? So it was nice to see the levels at which students were working. I don't know if you can hear, there's a toddler screaming in the background.
Oh no.
So distract him for a minute. I think as far as surprises actually go, I'm just trying to think right now what we're going to do. I think where the surprises will come in is when we get this survey data and we get that much more granular level focus about who multilingual writers are, because that allows us to do more thin slices to them. I was very pleased though to see that international students are meeting the learning goals, you know, meeting or exceeding the learning goals, not that differently than domestic students. There is a kind of always this underlying narrative that if they're international in their ESL, then they're somehow lesser students. And we absolutely are not seeing that in the data. It's not also a surprise to me, Elisa, that we're seeing that source use is the sticky point, because that really is a sticky point. I don't know if Greg or Devin want to weigh in about things that have been surprising for them in the project.
I can certainly add something. So first I just want to make a plug kind of for, there are a lot of conversations in digital humanities, especially on the value of using data analysis methods to even just to confirm what we do already know and add verify evidence, but also there's that tension, right, with trying to, in exploratory analysis, find sort of new things of interest to spur new research questions. So one of the things that that we didn't have time to include today were the so in all the trait scoring, in addition to low, medium, and high, the scores as we were together coming up with the with what the rubric would be really for trait scoring. Conversations emerged, okay, what if one of these traits does not apply to a particular genre? And a lot of this conversation especially focused around the sort of shows awareness of diverse perspectives trait. So one of the things that I look forward to seeing as we get some of this more granular data, once we're able to clean it and really regularize genre with our collective expertise on writing, is whether or not scorers are more likely than with some genres than others to mark certain traits or categories as, oh, that doesn't matter here. And that might have something to tell us about how scorers think about linguistic categories, genre, and other things like that. Devin, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, so especially, Greg, like you were saying during the training sessions, it was really cool to see how every professor had like a different perspective and input about how they looked at their own writing. And yeah, I'm also excited to see the more granular data, because just the way that they approach their own writing certainly affects the way that they score. So for example, like I remember in one of our calibration sessions, one of the scores was like, oh, well, they really tried. You can tell that they really tried. So that like sort of compassion is cool, but certainly impacts the way that they're scored. And that's why I also think it's helpful that we are rescoring a portion of the samples. I think like 20% or something we're doing.
Yeah.
Just to get some regularity.
So great. No, that's all very helpful. And I just want to, again, so let me just sort of wrap this up by saying how incredibly impressive it is that these teams have sort of figured out ways to function and continue to function and continue to move these projects forward in the current moment, which has many challenges. And I really appreciate everyone taking the time today, and especially because our time went over, appreciate everyone's patience. It is wonderful that you're all engaged in this diverse type of work, and have been finding innovative and new ways to involve students in these projects. And it's, as you know, a lot of the comments have said, I think one of the most exciting things about this discussion has been the sort of diversity of interests and types of students that are involved in these projects. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for coming. If the teams themselves could stay on the call for another few minutes, we'll do a smaller version of our initial wrap up. And again, thank you for everyone coming and listening to us talk about these CSSH multi-generational research team pilots, and I think they bode very well for the future of continuing these types of efforts in the college. So thank you, everyone.